Today's story is about Musi Musnuch. Listen to the story Musi told me from here on. It's a story that just happened a few months ago. Let me introduce Musi a bit. She's an ordinary teenage girl living in a province in the northeastern region. In Musi's family living in the same house. There's Musi's mother and aunt. Musi's father separated from her mother when Musi was still young. The aunt, who is her mother's older sister, is a housewife because her husband, Musi's uncle, passed away about 3 years ago. And because of this reason, this family has been living as 3 women like this for many years. The daily routine that Musi does together with her family regularly is going to the temple or making merit by offering alms. Not just on Buddhist holy days but every important religious day. You could say Musi's house is a fully Buddhist household in the traditional way, that is. They're all very devout. Every morning, before Musi goes to school or runs errands or goes to work or does whatever, she must wake up early to help the family cook food. Or if the family doesn't cook that day, she has to go out to buy rice and food to offer as alms. She has to go to the market near the house. And if any day the monks don't come for alms in front of the house, or if it's an important religious day, Musi's family will travel to make merit at the temple, to offer alms at the nearby temple. From everything I've told you, listeners may think Musi's family is probably like any other Buddhist family. And that's true, except that strange events occurred one morning. Musi and her mother woke up together and left the house together at around 5 a.m. That day, the house didn't cook food to wait to offer alms. The fog that day was quite heavy, more than usual, as it was starting to enter the rainy season. The sunlight that morning came later than every other day. The distance from the village to the market in front of the village was about 1 kilometer. So it was a bit tiring. But if you walk every day you get used to it. While Musi and her mother were walking, the two of them chatted casually as mother and daughter do, walking slowly here and there, talking along the way until they reached the entrance of the village. When they reached the entrance of the village, Musi and her mother saw a wandering monk, just looking with the naked eye. You could tell he was a wandering monk. His face was gaunt, wearing dark brown robes, different from other monks in the nearby temple where Musi and her mother offer alms every day. The monks at the temple near Musi's house who usually come for alms wear orange-yellow robes like typical city monks. This wandering monk that Musi saw, besides his robe color looking strange, his body also looked strange because his body looked emaciated. His arms and legs were thin and dry. And the strangest thing was that he had hair. And his hair was all messy, as if he had just come out of the forest and throughout the time he was in the forest, he had never shaved his head. Normally, the monks Musi sees shave their heads at least every holy day. But this wandering monk was different, as if he had traveled far because he had luggage and a bag. And the bag was not like a typical bag either, it was like an old bag. Bronze-colored. Moreover, he was walking past the front of the village barefoot. Behind this wandering monk, besides the monk, there was also a boy about 8 to 9 years old. From what she saw, she said he was probably the monk's follower or a temple boy. And this temple boy was like the monk, dressed shabbily, looking dirty, but this temple boy was also limping on one leg. And behind this boy, he was carrying things all messy. His face looked gloomy, not very clear from the distance Musi could see. The bodies of both the monk and the temple boy looked emaciated. Seeing that, Musi and her mother immediately looked at each other, as if they both couldn't believe their own eyes. Until Musi exclaimed, "Is that a wandering monk?" She turned to look at her mother and asked as if speaking to her mother. And as soon as Musi said that, suddenly the wandering monk and the temple boy stopped. They stopped still, as if they had heard what Musi said. It was strange because from the distance where Musi was standing to where the monk was walking past the village entrance, it was impossible for him to have heard that. Musi spoke in a very soft voice, turning to speak to her mother. She didn't shout or call out. Suddenly that monk stopped and turned to look at Musi as if he had heard what Musi said. The monk slowly turned to look at Musi and revealed his face to Musi. His face looked gloomy. pitch black. His body and face were covered with grime and black stains. One of his eyes was closed and swollen. The other eye was open, looking at Musi with squinting eyes like someone with narrow eyes. But actually, if it wasn't swollen like the other eye, it would be inflamed and about to close. The black eyes of this monk looked pitch dark, with the whites of his eyes red, like the eyes of someone with inflammation. That monk turned to look at Musi and moved his lips slightly as if trying to say something. And as I said, from the distance where the monk was standing to where Musi was standing with her mother, it was impossible for Musi to hear. But after the monk in front finished moving his lips, a voice from somewhere came to Musi's ear saying, "You are in your 25th year." At that moment, Musi was startled and quickly turned to the right, turning to look at the source of the loud sound behind her. There was no one behind Musi at that moment. Her hair stood on end. Her mother standing next to her had to ask what was wrong. Why she turned like that. Musi herself didn't know how to answer her mother about hearing the whisper of someone's voice next to her ear saying she was in her 25th year. And what was strange was that when Musi looked back at that monk and the temple boy walking behind were slowly walking away into the forest beside the village. The forest beside the village is a small forest, a roadside forest that shouldn't even be walked into. Musi saw this and nudged her mother, trying to get her mother to turn and look, but her mother said the monk had disappeared somewhere. She didn't know if her mother couldn't see, but Musi saw the monk and temple boy slowly walking into the forest beside the village. At that moment, both of them were already confused. And then suddenly Musi heard a strange voice telling her she was in her 25th year. And Musi saw the monk walk into the forest. Contrary to her mother who didn't see anything at all, Musi and her mother stood at the village entrance for quite a while. During the time the two of them stood seeing that monk, before they knew it, Musi and her mother had to hurry to the market. They had to hurry to buy food first because now there was an event at the temple. After the two of them finished buying things at the market, Musi's aunt, who lives in the same house, who I mentioned at the beginning of the video is her mother's older sister, had already gone to reserve a spot in the pavilion. The three of them prepared to make merit on the Buddhist holy day. Musi said another strange thing happened here. After the devotees in the pavilion finished making merit, there would be a period of pouring water to dedicate merit. Musi said that at that moment, while she and her family were pouring water to dedicate merit, of course, they had to bend down a little and slowly pour water from the container or the water pouring vessel and receive blessings. Right, at that moment, Musi said she was bowing her head and pouring water to dedicate merit as usual. Except that her eyes to the right, while she was bending to pour water, seemed to see that right next to her, right next to where she was sitting, there were the feet of two people standing nearby, standing almost touching her. Musi saw these feet were pitch black, like the feet of someone very dark-skinned or burned by fire, or who had been running through mud or walking through mud. The shins were covered with black stains all over. The first feet Musi saw were adult feet, dirty-looking feet with wounds all over the nails. The other feet standing next to them seemed to be smaller, probably a child of considerable age, about 9 to 10 years old. The feet of this child were similar. They were pitch black and the toenails were covered with black stains and wounds all over. When Musi saw the feet of these two people, her heart was pounding, but when she saw them, she didn't move away or look up because at that time the abbot was leading the water pouring dedication. Musi was concentrating on pouring water and meditating. After Musi finished pouring water, put down the water pouring vessel and looked up. Strangely, the legs of the two people standing next to Musi just now had disappeared somewhere. It seemed impossible because if they were real people, when Musi looked up, she should have at least seen the owners of those 2 feet standing next to her or walking away in front of her eyes. Because at that time, everyone in the pavilion was sitting still. There was no one standing at all. As soon as Musi turned and found only emptiness, the aunt sitting nearby had to nudge and ask if anything was wrong. Musi realized that today she was more fidgety than usual, turning left and right, even when pouring water to dedicate merit. She poured with shaky hands. Musi herself couldn't find an answer either about what she saw in the corner of her eye. And because Musi and her family make merit at the temple regularly. Besides the temple caretakers and all the merit makers. Besides the villagers who come to make merit at the temple and meet often. There is also the abbot. Musi and her family are close to him. Close here doesn't mean very intimate with him. But Musi said her family comes to make merit at the temple often and comes regularly every holy day without fail. So the abbot remembers their faces. Every time after making merit, the abbot sprinkles holy water for them. That day, the abbot must have seen that Musi herself was acting strangely. As if she wasn't focused, not composed. She was fidgeting back and forth. When the abbot sprinkled holy water, he asked if anything was wrong today. The abbot saw that Musi was fidgeting since receiving blessings. And since the abbot opened the topic like that, Musi told him that today she encountered several strange things. Musi said only this much, before she could tell anything more. Coincidentally, the abbot's phone rang, so Musi and her family had to excuse themselves and leave first. Since that day Musi herself had errands to run, and her aunt had to go to work. So it turned out that the merit making on that holy day. She didn't get to know anything about what she encountered, not even a bit, until that night. That night was like any other normal night. After Musi returned from running errands outside, she showered, took care of personal matters, and then went up to sleep in her own room. Musi's bedroom is on the second floor at the very front of the house. If you open the window, you'll see the street in the alley right away. It's like the master bedroom at the front of the house. Musi's house has a large mango tree in front. The mango tree of the house itself. She said she planted it since she was young. Now the mango tree is tall and its top extends beyond the roof of the house. While Musi was sleeping, she heard what sounded like someone knocking on the glass or something. The glass in front of Musi's room is right next to the headboard. When the glass shakes or if anything runs into the glass, it could be night insects or something. You can hear it clearly because her ear is right next to the glass. That knocking sound on the glass rang out several times, which woke Musi up. She looked left and right and saw that the glass in her room was moving as if someone was knocking on it and trying to shake it open. At that moment, Musi herself was scared, thinking it might be a thief. She didn't think about ghosts or anything. So Musi slowly gathered her courage and slowly opened the curtain until she saw that on the branch of the mango tree in front of the house, there was a boy standing. This boy, at first Musi didn't recognize him. He was standing on the mango branch, but he was standing with his head bowed, standing still. In both hands of that boy, he was clenching his fists tightly, because she had just woken up from bed. Her eyes at that time couldn't see clearly because there was a street light in front of the house that was shining brightly. But not long after Musi's eyes adjusted to the darkness and became accustomed. The details of that boy made Musi clearly remember that the boy standing on the mango branch in front of her house was that temple boy. The one who walked behind the wandering monk who walked into the village entrance. When Musi saw him, her heart was racing. She didn't know what to do because how did this boy suddenly come to stand on a mango branch inside her house fence? And why was he standing there in the middle of the night? Or was this boy a thief? While Musi was looking at that boy and standing confused, not long after, the glass window in front of her moved on its own. The glass moved as if someone was shaking the glass in front of her. As soon as the glass shook, Musi glanced down and saw that what was below the window was that wandering monk. That wandering monk that Musi saw earlier in the day, except now he was squatting under the window, sitting on the balcony in front of her room. The face of the man dressed like a monk that Musi saw was the same face as that monk who walked into the forest beside the village. The man squatting and looking up at Musi on the balcony was smiling, revealing that in his mouth there were no teeth at all. Not even one. It was full of wounds and maggots. When Musi saw that, she screamed loudly, closed the curtain back, and sat on her bed covering her face and crying. Not long after Musi screamed loudly, both her mother and aunt must have heard. The two of them rushed up to the second floor to Musi's room. They called out to Musi, but at that time she had no strength to walk to the door to open it. Until her aunt had to use a key to open it and rush into Musi. Both of them were confused about why Musi was crying now. Her mother and aunt thought Musi had a nightmare. No, what Musi saw was scary and shocking beyond what could be explained in human language. That night, Musi asked to go sleep with her aunt downstairs. In the morning of the next day, you could see that Musi had a dazed look and was sitting shaking. When called, she would startle, like what the ancients call lost soul. That morning, her mother and aunt took Musi to the temple to make merit with the abbot. When they arrived at the temple, Musi sat in a daze for a long time. She wanted to speak, wanted to explain, but didn't know where to start. Her mind had shrunk completely. She couldn't think of anything, didn't know how to explain. It seemed the abbot could see this. So he performed a ceremony like calling the soul back. There was a sacred thread tied around her head, and there were trays of savory and sweet offerings. He chanted Buddhist prayers for her. After the ceremony was finished, the abbot let Musi sit and calm her mind for quite a while, until Musi started to regain her senses. The abbot then called her over and asked what she had encountered. What had happened? Musi then told him everything, starting from what she thought was the beginning, that is, at the village entrance, from the first time Musi and her mother encountered that wandering monk and temple boy. From that time until the story of last night when Musi encountered the boy standing on the mango tree and encountered that monk sitting grinning on the balcony next to the window. The abbot listened to the whole story Musi told. The abbot then asked Musi how old she was now. Musi told him she was 25 years old. The abbot nodded and said briefly, "You are in your 25th year. Stories like this can happen. It might be normal." At that time, Musi and her mother were also confused about what it had to do with being in the 25th year. The abbot explained a bit that being in the 25th year depends on the individual. Some people may encounter things. Some people's 25th year may be a normal ordinary year. It depends on the person because each person's past karma is different. The abbot said that if you believe, being in the 25th year allows Musi to perceive strange things because it's normal in the spirit world or it's normal for spirits. It's just that Musi happened to see them herself. The abbot also said that after this, after passing the 25th year birthday period, everything will gradually return to normal. The abbot gave reasons about what Musi encountered like this. The abbot said that when he was a young monk, when he was still a junior monk and not yet the abbot, at that spot in the forest next to the temple, which was a shortcut to the back of the stupa, a monk from the temple had died there. The abbot said that spot and the area next to Musi's village are actually the same area. He said that when the landowner came to develop the village, they left that forest area intending to make it a shortcut to the temple. For some reason, after the old landowner died and divided the land for his children, the children didn't use that forest land next to the temple to make a shortcut road to the back of the stupa into the temple as their father had intended. It's like the children inherited it but didn't do what their father wanted. And so the children left that land abandoned. It's like they tried to sell it several times, but it never sold. And as mentioned, at that spot, a monk from the temple had died while on his alms round. This monk's death was because the temple boy who was his disciple and followed him on alms rounds every day took the monk's life while he was walking back to the temple. For what reason? The abbot said it's not clear because there wasn't much evidence at that time. It was a long time ago, in ancient times when the internet wasn't widespread. But as far as the abbot knew, that temple boy, it was said that he intended to change the monk's life and wanted to steal valuables and money from that monk and from the monk's quarters. The monk who died wasn't very well behaved, ordaining to make a living and for offerings. So in his quarters, there were many valuable possessions, and it seems this disciple must have seen the unfair distribution of benefits. So the boy carried out the act. Musi told the abbot that the person walking behind that wandering monk was a child. But the abbot objected. He said that as far as he remembered, that temple boy's body was that of a child. but in reality he was an adult. It's like that boy's body was abnormal. If you looked with the naked eye, he might look like a child, but he was actually a dwarf or already an adult, a teenager, but his body was still childlike. And from the incident where that monk died at the village entrance, the temple boy who committed the act disappeared, except he didn't disappear for long before the police caught him in another province. The police report said that when they caught that temple boy, he was near death. It's like after fleeing the crime, he went to steal things until the villagers in that area gathered and took justice into their own hands. By the time the police arrived at the scene, that temple boy's condition was almost comatose. He didn't die there but at the hospital later. After all of this happened, the abbot said the shortcut behind the stupa that was the forest next to the village, next to the temple, was closed off and fenced. It's like the temple forced people to enter and exit the temple by only one way. After Musi and her family learned about everything that had happened, the abbot said that after this, she probably wouldn't encounter it again because today the abbot had performed a ceremony for her. This ceremony was like a soul-calling ceremony, a ceremony to ward off misfortune. The abbot also said that when Musi makes merit, she should dedicate the merit to them too. Don't think about how they were bad people when alive. Just know that as spirits, they're already suffering. We should have compassion. The abbot said the spirits probably wanted to ask for merit. They didn't intend to haunt or anything because they themselves are suffering terribly in their realm already. They probably don't have the heart to use their free time to scare people. This is Musi's story. Mus Nutch. Let me guess. I think the owner of this story probably encountered hungry ghosts. I want listeners to forget about ghosts in movies because in reality, they aren't necessarily tall or anything. There may be some, but I think hungry ghosts are pitiful beings. They're quite pitiful because they're quite hungry and suffering greatly, according to the scriptures. Actually, hungry ghosts come in many forms. They don't necessarily have to be tall with tiny mouths and hands like palm leaves as in movies. Some look like normal people. It's just that they are beings in the hungry ghost realm. Sometimes they may look like ordinary people. It's just that their bodies are not like humans. Sometimes they look human but may have organs in their body that produce toxins or something. I'm speaking according to my knowledge. Please use some discretion in listening. I don't know what the truth is. I apologize because I myself have never seen a real hungry ghost. I've only seen ducks. Now I'm ordained as a monk. Mus Nutch. Someone once taught me that if we are monks, our good deeds will be multiplied by 10 or 100. But if we do bad things or commit sins, being a monk will make those bad deeds multiplied by 10 or 100 as well. Wearing the yellow robes and doing bad things can sometimes easily drag us down to the lower realms, more easily than ordinary people. So Mus Nutch, what do you think about this story of Musi? Do you think what Musi encountered was really strange? What are your thoughts? You can comment below. My team and I will reply to every message for sure. For today, thank you very much for listening until the end. See you again with Midnight Chronicler in the next episode. I hope tonight is a good night for you.